So, hey guys, listen, we're all trying to get more productive. And the question is, how do you find a way to get an edge? I'm a big believer that if you're getting mentoring or you're in an environment that causes growth, a growth-based environment, that you're much more likely to grow and you're going to grow faster. And that's why I love Growth Day. Growth Day is an app that my friend Brendan Burchard has created that I'm a big fan of. Write this down, growthday.com/ed. So if you want to be more productive, by the way, he's asked me, I post videos in there every single Monday that get your day off to the right start. He's got about $5,000, $10,000 worth of courses that are in there that come with the app. Also, some of the top influencers in the world are all posting content in there on a regular basis, like having the Avengers of personal development and business in one app. And I'm honored that he asked me to be a part of it as well and contribute on a weekly basis, and I do. So go over there and get signed up. You're going to get a free, tuition-free voucher to go to an event with Brendan and myself and a bunch of other influencers as well. So you get a free event out of it also. So go to growthday.com/ed. That's growthday.com/ed.
Communication is humans' superpower. Like, it's the reason as a species we have been so successful is that we can talk to each other and we can build, we can share knowledge. And communication over the millennia has been hardwired into our brain.
Experience is the best teacher. That's a simplistic statement, but it's not true. Although experience is not the best teacher, reflection and learning from that experience is the best teacher.
Verbal communication, physical communication, the art of getting your message across and influencing others and painting the word picture so that they can be all in on your vision,
Yes.
is a lost art.
But we aren't trained to ask questions. We're trained to have answers. And then we get into business and we're rewarded for being the smartest person in the room. That's a counter to the opposite effect is asking questions.
You're going to listen to a big brain today, everybody, on a topic that you need to know more about. I got to tell you why I love your book so much. We were just talking about kids off camera.
Yeah.
There's a few things I want my kids to have left my house with. One, I want them to have some faith, which is their morals and ethics. I want them to have some work ethic, self-confidence. And if I could give them a fourth thing, it would be the ability to be an outstanding communicator. And I just think it's one of the things that is the most important elements of life. I'm sure you agree.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the things that you mentioned before that are really important, because if you could be a great communicator, and if you don't have values, if you don't have discipline, then it's not necessarily going to get you anyplace. But the difference between people who have those first three things and then don't know how to communicate is that they stall out at some point, right? They have trouble in their marriage. They have trouble like communicating with their spouse or their partner. They oftentimes stall out at work because the thing that made them successful at work, once you become a manager, it's not just doing that. It's about helping other people learn how to do that. And also, there's a huge amount of self-discovery that comes from conversation, right? Like when I talk to you and you talk to me, we learn things about ourselves through what we say. And it takes someone talented, a super communicator, to draw that out, to know how to make the space for that.
That's interesting. You learn about yourself too. I didn't even think about it that way, but you're right. You know, I almost feel like after I was reading your book, and by the way, everybody, it is outstanding. This man does not write average books. He just doesn't. And he sells a lot of them for a reason. And I almost feel like after reading it, I think I thought this before, but almost your ability to communicate will be the cap on your life to some extent. It's the cap on your the intimacy level in your relationship, for example, to some extent is limited or enhanced by your ability to communicate nonverbal cues, verbal cues, your ability to lead and move people in business, your family environment, friendships. I mean, the cap on your success level in those areas is almost directly correlated to communication.
I absolutely. So my father passed away about 6 years ago, and I went to his funeral. And there were so many more people there. There were people that like I hardly remembered, like people, I was so surprised. And I was talking to them and I was like, thank you for coming. And they would all say the same thing. They'd say like, I loved talking to your dad. Right? That's why they showed up, is because they had this they had a connection with him.
Do you think it's because of, I think one thing human beings have, Charles, is you're always making people feel something.
Yeah.
Yet I think most people are oblivious to that fact. They're feeling something from you in a moment. Your interest level, your energy, your frequency, your trustworthiness, your ability to elevate them. So do you think with your dad, for example, it wasn't just, talking with him, but it was how he made other people feel?
That's exactly what it was. So sometimes when people ask me like, how do you define a super communicator? The easiest answer is to say, okay, think of the person you would call if you were having a bad day. Right? Like you're having a terrible day. There's someone you call, they're going to make you feel better. Yeah. Like who would that person be for you?
It would have been my dad,
okay,
for sure, before he passed away. That came right to me. Call my dad.
And my guess is that if I met your dad, what I would see is He's not the funniest person in your life.
No.
He's not the most charismatic person in your life. But what he did is he proved to you that he was listening to you, that he heard what you said. And then he reciprocated your vulnerability or your joy or your sadness. He shared it with you. And as a result, you walked away feeling like, what I'm experiencing, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, this is profound and this is real.
You're right.
And it's been validated. And you don't need your dad to validate it. Like, it's still real to you. But to have someone else have them feel like they genuinely want to understand you.
That's right.
That feels wonderful. In fact, it's hardwired into our brain to feel wonderful.
Yeah. I just did this, and I did a podcast on it, so I'll ask you this. How much of communication do you think is actually the ability to listen correctly?
A huge amount. So, and let me say that there's this thing about listening, which is when I'm talking, whatever you're doing, I'm probably not going to pay attention to it because it's so cognitively intense to try and speak that even though I'm going to make eye contact with you and I'm going to kind of notice if you're frowning or smiling or whatever it is, I'm really not going to pick up on the signals you're sending me. So listening is not just hearing what the person is saying, it's what you do after they finish talking. Because if you do this thing where you prove to me that you've been listening, and in the psychology literature, this is actually referred to as looping for understanding.
Okay.
That particularly if you have a conflict with someone, the best way to sort of bring the tension down is ask a question, repeat back what you hear the person says in your own words. Okay. And then step number 3, which is the one we usually forget, is ask them if you got it right. And if I do that, so when you think about it, so I'm listening to you. I have to listen closely to you because I'm thinking I got to repeat back what you're saying in my own words. I got to process it. But most importantly, you know that I've been listening based on what I say after you're done speaking. And that's really what active listening is. It's about not just passively receiving. It's about amplifying.
Very good. Wow, that is really good.
And the thing is, it's so easy to do. Like once I learned this, like I find myself doing it all the time without even realizing it. Like I'll be like, what I hear you saying is, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong. And like, it just feels so natural. Like it feels totally automatic.
So good to have somebody say that back to you.
Right?
Because you do get the feeling with most people, I think they do 2 things. One, they're really more concerned with what they're about to say back to you.
Yes.
And 2, I call them verbal nudges, where they're interrupting you too often or which you think is a form of agreement, but I think to some extent sometimes you're almost saying, I got it. Okay, can I say something now?
Yeah.
And
That's
you're almost
exactly
nudging them to finish rather than letting them finish.
I think that's exactly true. And I think that part of this is understanding what the goal of a conversation is.
Okay.
So it's easy to go into a conversation and think the goal is to convince this person I'm right, or maybe even the goal is just to come to agreement on something. That's wrong. The goal of a conversation is simply to understand what the other person is trying to tell you. So that means that if I'm listening to you and you say something that I think is crazy, you wouldn't say this, but lizard people run the world or whatever it is. I'm not going to agree with you and I'm probably not going to convince you that you're wrong. But as long as I understand how you see the world, as long as I ask you a question, what's known as a deep question, where I say like, why is this important? Like, what is it about this that seems really meaningful and important to you? You're going to tell me something about who you are. I'm going to repeat back what you've told me about, like, I care about lizard people because I really think the elites of this world are like having this pernicious effect on the working class. I'm going to repeat that back to you. I'm going to ask you if I got it right. I'm not going to agree with you and you're not going to agree with me, but simply understanding each other means we have succeeded. And it feels good, right?
It does. I'm just thinking of like political discourse, like just really understand where they're coming from. I'm not going to win this. I have to tell you, your work's so good because it's actually the part of conversations. I think it's why I have a podcast. I really enjoy not only understanding what somebody's saying, but also like why they're saying it. What's this come from? I'm in an Uber. I basically interview almost every Uber driver I ever have, right? But I love that by the end of a good 20 or 30 minute ride, I find out where these belief systems stem from too. I was in one recently where this guy was way right, like way right. And no matter what you believe politically, but I was like, whoa. And I'm like trying to understand. And I've also had this conversation with someone who's way left. But it ended up that at the end, I found out that he had come from a communist country. He had actually had family that were murdered by communists. Whether I agreed with him or not, that's not the point of this show.
but I actually had a much deeper understanding of the basis from which he's formed these opinions, and I really felt connected with this person.
Absolutely.
So you're right.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So when you're in that Uber, when you're having that, what's the second or third question you ask? Because you could be like, hey, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Europe. Like, what are you asking next to get you from the shallow to the deep?
Oh, that's a really good question. I usually ask them, I open them up a little bit. I say, give me your craziest story.
Oh, interesting.
So I actually ask them to give me one of their crazy ride stories. I'm actually fascinated by that. So it kind of opens them up and they get loose. I didn't do it tactically, but I found that like, well, you're kidding me, that did that. And then typically for me, just because I'm most intrigued by it, I love to know about people's families. And I actually also think people love to talk about their families typically too. So usually I'll ask them, are you married? Do you have children? And I know that sounds like basic stuff, but I find for me that that's an entree into learning an awful lot about these folks.
What I love about that is that and I think you got this by intuition, is that, so these deep questions, if we ask people deep questions are things that ask us about our values, our beliefs, or our experiences.
Okay.
So what's the craziest ride you've ever given someone is asking this guy about his experiences.
Very good. Okay.
Right?
I didn't know I was doing that.
Tell me about your kids. Like, what are your kids like? At some point, he could just be like, I have 2 kids. But at some point, you're probably going to say like, oh, do they like school? What are they like? Where do they go to school? Are you worried about their future? Yep. You're going to ask something that's going to get him to reveal to you who he really is.
You're right. And by the way, I always look at people like, this is an overall belief system. This person's a gift. I want to open them up. It's really how I look at them. And in this guy's case,
love that.
I just got to tell you, in this guy's case, really quick, just an interjection. This dude was amazing. It turns out that the reason he's driving Uber is he has a daughter at Harvard and a son at Stanford, right? And he's putting them through school. And if you knew where this man came from, it was remarkable. And the pride he had in his children and his wife, and that they had raised them and they were there. And it became this like really beautiful conversation where not only did I admire, I was like, whoa, this is an incredible, the life you've built, the sacrifice you're making. And he had a full-time day job, and it became kind of this conversation. We talked about our children, and by the time I was done, I actually really had a connection with this man that I probably won't, I'm talking about him on my podcast now, right? So let me ask you this.
Okay.
The details of the work, guys, we're going to get into now. There are really 3 conversation types, okay? I didn't know there were. I was kind of oblivious to this, but I think just this alone would enlighten people so they know which conversation they're in and they can identify it. So
Absolutely.
share us some of that.
This is a big discovery from the last decade, and we're kind of living through this golden age of understanding communication and for the first time in a new way. And what the first thing that researchers have found is that we think of a discussion as being about one thing. We're talking about my book, or we're talking about your kids.
Yeah.
But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations that ebb and flow. And most of those different kinds of conversations fall into one of 3 buckets. There's a practical conversation where we're talking about plans or making decisions together, or we're fixing problems. Politics is often this. There's an emotional conversation where if I tell you how I'm feeling about something, I do not want you to fix it for me. I want you to acknowledge that you've heard it, and I want you to tell me, to sort of be vulnerable with me. And then there's a social conversation. And a social conversation is about how we relate to each other in society, how we think other people see us, how our identities, right? How our identities shape how we see the world in different and interesting ways. And the key is, there's this thing known as the matching principle, which is, if I'm having an emotional conversation and you respond with a practical conversation, even though both of what we're saying is legit, we're not going to hear each other.
That is outstanding.
This happens at home, with my spouse all the time. I come home, I've had a tough day at work, I'm complaining about my boss. My wife says, she solves the problem. She says, why don't you go and take him out to lunch and get to know each other better? And instead of being like, that's really good advice, I'm like, you don't understand, you're not listening to me.
Very good, Charles. Yeah.
So if she matches me and then invites me to match her, then we're having the same kind of conversation. Then we can hear each other.
You just explained 25 years of problems. No, because I'm coming home to an emotional conversation and I'm not in one sometimes.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to somebody who, we were talking about socially, I just moved and you were asking me about the move, and I said, I kind of revert back to myself socially. And I think I would categorize myself, it would surprise most people listening to the show, but I'm very quiet and very shy. And I find a lot of public speakers are, by the way. A lot of entertainers privately are very, I'd call an introvert.
Yeah.
You have any advice for an introvert as it comes to communication like this?
So I think one of the things I heard you just say when you were talking about that Uber driver is you got into the car and he had one identity, which is right wing.
Yeah.
And you asked him some deep questions that were easy to ask. Like they didn't seem intimate. And he started telling you about his other identities. And once he complicated himself, once he said like, look, I'm not just one thing, I'm 3 and 4 and 5 things. All of a sudden, it's easy to feel close to that person because some of those things he is, you are too. And so I think when it comes to introverts or when you move to a new place, like one of the things that I like to do is you meet someone at a party or a barbecue or whatever it is. And like I often ask them, what do you do for a living? And then I'll often say, they say, I'm a lawyer. And I say, do you love practicing the law? Like, what made you decide to become a lawyer? Like, when was the moment you decided to become a lawyer? What inevitably they say is something that tells me about their other identities, which is, I became a lawyer because I saw my dad get arrested and I wanted to fight for the underdog. Or I became a lawyer because we were poor and I wanted to always have enough money. Or I became a lawyer because I love intellectual stimulation. Like, think of those 3 answers just told me so much about those different people. And at that point, I can say to them, I grew up poor too. Like, I understand what that's like. And now suddenly we feel safe with each other. I think this isn't necessarily true for introverts, but when we're in new social situations and we were talking about how hard it is to make friends when you don't have friends in a place, the thing that often stops us is just a little mild anxiety.
You're right. Oh, at least mild with me.
Yeah.
At least mild with me.
And how are we going to start the conversation? How are we going to get out of the conversation?
Okay, that's mine.
Okay.
I'm okay opening a conversation. How are you? Where you for me, it's, how does this end? How does this end? I bet everybody driving or listening to these, like, no, that's something I would like to know more about.
If
How
I'm
does
on
this
the bus
end? I have the most
next to-
awkward finishes of conversations of any dude you've ever met in your life. I'm like, okay, well, hey. And I usually end up the conversation with some sort of BS or something. You're like, I'm going to use the restroom.
Right.
I don't know how to get away from you.
I have to go refresh my glass, which is still half full. So actually, Daniel Gilbert at Harvard actually did an entire study trying to figure out how people end conversations.
Yeah.
And does the other person want to end at the same time you do? And what he found was 2 things. Number 1, he found that you think I want you to end the conversation because I'm getting bored, and actually I am enjoying this conversation. We do a difficult job of gauging the other person's interest in the conversation.
Okay.
But then sometimes we want to end the conversation, right? And so this is what supercommunicators do.
Okay.
They forecast it without committing to it immediately. So they say something like, oh, man, this is so interesting. I totally got to go like freshen up my drink. But before I do, like, let me ask you like X, because oftentimes the end of the conversation feels hard because it feels awkward.
Yes.
But if you've already set the table and you're like, I got to step away, but this is so fascinating. Let me ask you one more thing.
Gotcha.
Then when they're done answering the question, you're like, oh man, thank you so much. And you just turn away. That's not awkward.
I love that. That's pre-framing the conclusion.
That's exactly right.
Very good.
That's exactly right.
A lot of what you're saying, I'm listening, it has to do with the questions you're asking. I think a lot of people look at conversations or communication like, what am I telling somebody? What am I saying? And I'm sure there's an element of that we'll get to in a minute too. But so far, a lot of the things you've been suggesting involve questions you're asking somebody. And I have to say this to you. I'm amazed how many people I talk to in social environments and business environments that don't ask any questions.
I know. And I can't figure out, I think that for some of them, they're just not practiced at it. And that's the thing about super communication. Anyone can be a super communicator. It's literally just a set of skills. Like, you just have to practice the skills and make them into habits. Nobody's born knowing how to do this. But I have the same, it drives me crazy. I ask question after question, and then they answer, and then they stop talking, and they're waiting for my next question. I'm like, is there any? So here's the thing that you're exactly right. 50%, if not more, of a good conversation is asking good questions. Okay. But then something happens. There's a difference between a conversation and an interrogation, right, or an interview. Yeah. And this gets into what's known as emotional reciprocity. And emotional reciprocity is basically one of the strongest impulses that all humans have. If somebody engages in emotional reciprocity, we can't help but feel a little bit closer and a little bit more trusting of them. So emotional reciprocity says, if you say something vulnerable,
yes,
and then I acknowledge that vulnerability, but I also show that I can be vulnerable, then we're going to feel like we can trust each other. And that's about speaking. So that doesn't mean if you say, my dad passed away, I should be like, oh, I understand completely because my aunt passed away 12 years ago.
Okay.
Like, that's stealing the spotlight from you, right?
Okay.
But if you say, my dad passed away, and I say, oh man, I know how hard that can be. Like, tell me about your dad. What was he like?
Oh gosh, it's good.
Right? And then and what I'm signaling to you is A, I'm interested in you. I want to hear from you. I want to understand you. But B, you learned something about me. And if you're interested, you can say tell me how you know about this. Like, what happened?
What about being the server first, serving the vulnerability first?
Absolutely. There's a guy named Nick Epley at the University of Chicago who's in the book. And like, Nick is so good at this. Every conversation I've ever had with him, he says something in the conversation, near the start of the conversation, that feels so intimate.
Yeah.
And as a result, I'm just like, I love this guy. Like, I just want to talk to him. And again, when I look at the transcripts, because I'm oftentimes talking to him for reporting, and when I read the transcript, it doesn't seem too intimate. It doesn't seem overly intimate, but he says things like, hey, Nick, how are you doing? Like, instead of saying, oh, fine, says something like, it's great. I went to my son's soccer game this weekend. And we adopted these kids from Ethiopia, and just watching them now as these strong young men, it was a great weekend.
Brother,
And
you're
then,
on it.
Right. And he's offered that up. And at that point, I'm like, man, I'll tell you all about myself.
Let me tell you about me. I think I also trust you more when you do that.
Absolutely.
I think when someone's so surface all the time, and by the way, this applies for a lot of you that are in sales too.
Yes.
Being willing to be a little bit vulnerable, not always the expert, but a little bit vulnerable, a little bit transparent, a little bit revealing. I believe I think it's just a better way to live, but it does bond and connect you. It makes you human. Oftentimes when you're in sales, people look at you like you're almost their adversary. Like, I can't trust this guy or this lady. But when you begin to show some vulnerability and some authenticity, I think that's when you start to break down the barriers. And I found that in my own life.
Absolutely.
Over and over.
Trust is huge, right? I mean, so communication is humans' superpower. Like, it's the reason as a species we have been so successful is that we can talk to each other and we can share knowledge, we can build families and communities. All of that is based on communication. And communication over the millennia has been hardwired into our brain. And so as a result, when somebody communicates well with me, I trust them because I literally have 2 million years of evolution in my head that says, trust the guy who it seems like wants to understand you and that is sharing with you.
I agree. This is so good. This is probably going to go a little longer than normal, guys.
No, I love it.
I really love this, right? I just think, I hope those of you that are listening or watching understand the importance in your life, as I said earlier, of getting good at this, because it's the cap on your bliss. It's the cap on your laughter. It's the cap on your intimacy. It's the cap on your influence and persuasion.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about difficult conversations?
Yeah.
Are those different in nature? And are they, having to, say, hey, listen, your job performance isn't very good, or I'm frustrated with you, or, something that's, you're going into it knowing, gosh, I wish I didn't have to have this conversation, but I do.
Yeah. Or sometimes they catch you off guard, right? Where like, I'm talking about one thing and all of a sudden I realize you're furious at me. Like, I didn't pick up on that until just now. And so the answer is they abide by the same rules, but the fact that you're in conflict changes the context enormously, because we were just talking about trust, right? Yeah. I can establish trust by sharing something about myself. But if you go into a conversation where there's conflict, trust is already out the window, right? Like, your fight or flight is going off in your head like crazy. You can't trust someone easily just because they ask you a question. So, and this has been a focus of a lot of study. How do we make conversations in conflict better? And there's basically two things. The first one is, I mentioned this looping for understanding, right? Asking a question, repeating back what you heard, and then asking if you got it right. That's enormously powerful in conflict.
Okay.
Because the first suspicion I have if you disagree with me and we're in conflict with each other is you're waiting your turn to speak. Yeah. You're not hearing what I'm saying, right? Yep. You're just waiting there and I'm going to tell you my piece and then you're going to just bulldoze over me and I'm going to bulldoze back. So if you interrupt that by proving you are listening, using looping for understanding to prove I really want to understand what you're saying. Help me understand. I'm taking a huge amount of mistrust off the table. The second thing that often happens in conflict, and this happens a lot in marriages, this actually comes from marriage therapy and studies of marriage therapy, is that it is natural when we feel threatened to want to control things. And the easiest thing to control is the other person. So you tell me your thing and I'm like, no, you don't know the evidence. Let me show you the evidence. You say something and you're like, I'm not even going to listen to this. I try and control you. I try and tell you what you should believe, what you should feel. That's toxic, right? In a marriage, that is the thing that destroys a marriage. The alternative is, I have a need for control. You have a need for control. We feel threatened. Can we find things to control together? So for instance, can we control the timing of this fight? Instead of having it at 2 a.m, can we wait till it's 10 a.m. and we're both a little bit more rested?
Very good.
Can we control ourselves? Can I let you know, I'm going to take a second before I speak and I'm going to think about what you just said. Can I show you that I'm trying to control myself and invite you to control yourself? And the third thing is we can control the boundaries of the conflict itself. So one of the most toxic patterns in marriages is this thing called kitchen sinking, where we start arguing about like where we're going to go for New Year's. And then like 5 minutes later, it's like, and your mother hates me and you don't earn enough money. And like, why are you such a jerk all the time? Right. So a fight about one thing becomes a fight about everything. The healthy way to do that is to say, we need to have a fight. Like we have a disagreement on something. Let's control the boundaries of it. We're talking about New Year's Eve. If my mother comes up and your money comes up, like we're just going to set it aside. That's another conversation another day.
Very good.
But then when we're controlling these three things, we're controlling ourselves, we're controlling the environment, and we're controlling the boundaries of the fight or the conflict. We're controlling those as partners. Right? We're on the same side of the table. We might not agree on the topic we're discussing.
Right.
But you and I are partners now in controlling the right things in this fight instead of trying to control each other.
That's outstanding. When you're talking about relationships and family, first off, I've made those mistakes.
Me too.
I'm a pretty good kitchen sinker, now that you term it that way.
Yeah.
And so I think I've gotten better at it. I also think the longer you're with somebody, you have more stuff in the sink. And so it's even more important to avoid that and have that control of the parameters around the conversation.
Right. How long have you been married for?
26 years.
Okay, so I'm coming up on 20, and I'm sure this has happened to you, but tell me if I'm getting this wrong, which is there are these things, literally I can say 2 words and I know the entire fight in my wife's head. Right? It's like and sometimes I don't even mean to say them. I'm just like I'm like, well, it's because like I earn more money than you. And then I'm like, oh, nuts. Like,
there we go.
I just stepped in it. Like to kitchen sink it, all I had to say was literally 3 words.
You brought the whole sink.
Yeah. And so the immediate thing I do is I'm like, I'm sorry.
Whoops. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I did not mean to do that.
Yes.
Like, tell me what you're feeling because I want to give you a chance. But like,
you know what? I've gotten better at that, Charles, with my kids too, of saying, you know what? I'm sorry. Let me take that right back. Whereas before I'd almost double down, or they didn't really feel it that bad. It'll be brushed under. And no, sometimes you just have to, in the moment, go, let me yank that one back.
And not only are you connecting with them, but think about the modeling you're doing.
Right.
You're teaching them how to communicate with other people. Like, I'm absolutely certain your kids are going to copy that without even realizing it comes from dad.
Yeah. You're making me think of young people when you say that. I want you to can we teach this to young people? I'll tell you why I ask.
Yeah.
I have great conversations with my kids. Bella, don't take this the wrong way, sweetheart, when you're listening to this. But lately with my daughter, I love doing kind of dates with my daughter and I. And she's a sophomore in college. And I watch her with other people. She's quite the conversationalist. But with me, and she's not disinterested, but when we're talking, there's a lot of, yep, yeah, right, uh-huh. And at one point, we were taking a walk on the beach over Christmas, and I said, Bella, this is kind of a serve and volley type thing here. Like, I serve and you return the serve, and then I hit the ball back to you, and you hit it back to me. To your point of ask me something.
Right.
So it made me wonder, is there anything different? And maybe she's not even quite at that age I'm talking about, but if I have an 8, a 9, a 10-year-old, I'm always blown away when I meet a child who is a tremendous communicator, makes eye contact, shakes your hand. Mr. Mylett, how are you? What do you do? Like when they ask, I'm like, automatically what I think, these are great parents.
Yes.
I think immediately these are tremendous parents. So is there anything with young people that these skills can be taught? Anything unique that you would say that goes with young people?
Absolutely. So I think that there's two things. Let's talk about the older kids first, like your daughter's age. So I had a friend whose daughter just went to college, and he had a conversation with her before he left, which I've now imitated and I love. He sat down with her and he was like, look, you're definitely going to call us when something important happens in your life. Mm-hmm. But if that's the only time you call, then by definition, you're not calling us that frequently. Mm-hmm. Like, we're going to lose contact with each other. Mm-hmm. So what I want you to do is I want you to call me for the unimportant things. You had a bad day, but it's not a big deal. You ate something good for lunch. You're working on this paper and it's kind of interesting. We don't have to talk for more than 5 or 7 minutes, right? Yeah. But I want you to call me and tell me about the unimportant stuff, because the important stuff will take care of itself. Mm-hmm. And so my son went off to boarding school. He's at boarding school right now here in California, and it's his first year there. He's in 10th grade, and I told him this. He calls me every day.
Very, very.
I actually talk more to this kid with him at boarding school than I did when he was at home.
Yes.
So for older kids, that's the thing, is to say this is a priority. Like, conversation is something. None of us are born super communicators. We can all learn how to do it. This is a skill you should practice, it's because it's important. Yep. For the younger kids, it's a little bit harder, right?
Yes. But
I think for them, this is where the deep questions become so powerful. So my younger one, same thing. How was school today? Good.
Right.
What'd you learn? Nothing. Right? Like, so some of the advice is like, be like, oh, well, did pirates show up today? And you can do that a couple times. Yeah. But at some point, if you ask them a question where you're asking them to tell you who they are, I know that you said that you like science more than you like math. I'm just wondering, why? What is it? Was it about science? Is science important to you? You told me you wanted to hang out with your friend, and I'm just wondering, what is it? What do you like about that friend? What is special to him? Yeah. What's great about that is that, first of all, it's clearly not judgmental, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas if I'm like, what'd you learn today? Mm-hmm. I'm kind of judging.
Good point.
You better should have learned something today.
Very good point.
But second of all, I'm matching him and I'm allowing him to set the stage. Mm. It's not that he's playing on my ball court. Mm. I'm saying to him, tell me your ball court. Mm. And that's powerful.
So if you're thinking about finding a unique gift this holiday, let me tell you something that could really help the people that you love grow and get better. You can't do any better than Masterclass. Masterclass allows you and your loved ones to learn from the best to become their best. Take an expert in an industry, and they're on Masterclass. It's the only streaming platform where you can learn and grow with over 200 of the world's best at what they do. Learn from any Masterclass instructor anywhere on a smartphone, computer, smart TV, or even in audio mode. I have to tell you, I'm doing a cooking thing on there right now because I really want to make better food for the fam. And so I'm on there right now doing through a cooking thing. And the classes make a difference. 80% of the members feel Masterclass made a positive impact in their life, and there's no risk. Every new membership, 30-day money-back guarantee. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/Mylett for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/Mylett. Masterclass.com/Mylett. Hey, everybody, you know what I did right before I came in here to shoot today's podcast? I took my AG1 drink for the morning. It's part of my morning routine every single day. I can tell you, I know the mornings when I forget or I miss it because I just don't feel the same. AG1 can help combat the stress of holiday schedules while helping your digestion, supporting your energy. For me, I really feel it in my energy. So this holiday season, try AG1 for yourself or even gift it to someone special. It's a perfect time to focus on supporting your body with an easy and surprisingly delicious daily health drink. And that's why I'm so excited to be partnering with them. Every week of November, AG1 will be running a special Black Friday offer for a free gift with your first subscription, in addition to the welcome kit with vitamin D3 plus K2. So make sure to check out drinkag1.com/Ed Mylett to see what gift you can get this week. That's drinkag1.com/Ed Mylett to start your holiday season off on a healthier note while supplies last.
You do a lot of gestures when you talk.
Oh, yeah?
I don't know if you noticed that. Well, you're expressive in your face. I mean, this may not even be in the book, but I want to ask you about it. So you're expressive with your face. You use your hands. And I'm wondering if nonverbal cues are part of being a super communicator? Because I've had people say, I'm really excited to be here. And I'm like, you should tell your face. You should email your face and let them know that you're excited to be here. So I think a lot of it is I'm reading things you're not saying when I talk to somebody as well.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And to be a super communicator, you don't have to have nonverbal, right? Because there's people who like on the phone are fantastic. If you're good at one thing, you're usually good at everything.
Okay.
But similarly with you, like you clearly telegraph non-verbally or non-linguistically, you telegraph your interest, you telegraph what you're hearing. And that's very, very powerful. And there's a kind of a science behind it. And we've learned a lot of it from looking at laughter. So the interesting thing about laughter is studies show that about 80% of the time when all of us laugh, it is not in response to something funny.
Okay.
Right? So we've laughed a couple of times in this interview. Yeah. But I haven't said anything that funny, right? Like you just laughed.
Yeah.
I'm not that funny a guy.
Okay.
So what happens when we laugh? Okay. What a laugh actually is it's saying to the other person, I want to connect with you. I'm going to show you that I want to connect with you. And then when they laugh back, and 90% of the time when I laugh, the person I'm talking to will laugh back. They're saying, I want to connect back.
That's tremendous.
So that's a non-linguistic communication. And what I love is actually NASA for a time.
I was going to ask you this.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. Yeah.
So they were trying to figure out how to find emotionally intelligent astronauts.
Yeah, you're going to.
And like the problem is, everyone who applies to be an astronaut, if you make it to the final stages, you're like a golden boy or girl, right? Like
1,000%.
Yeah, you know how to answer every question.
Yes.
You've practiced everything, and they're like, we can't figure out who's actually emotionally intelligent and who fakes it really, really well. But when they're in space on a 6-month mission, the difference is going to matter a lot.
Huge. Yeah.
So this one psychologist, he started realizing if I pay attention to how people laugh, most importantly, do they match my laughter? So he would come into a room and he would accidentally spill papers accidentally. He actually did it on purpose. And then he would laugh uproariously and he would watch what that candidate would do. Some candidates would be like, because you know you're supposed to laugh, right? Mm-hmm. And then other people would be like, let me help you with that. Like the astronauts who matched him, not just on laughter, but he would tell a sad story and see if the other person empathized, if they engaged in reciprocity, if they asked him questions about it. So that's non-linguistic, but it tells us whether that person wants to connect. And that's ultimately, I think when I'm making gestures, I'm inviting you in, right? I'm saying like,
yes.
Like here I am. Like
yes.
I want you to see what I'm seeing.
I hope what everybody's getting out of this is like these are skills that can be learned. There's
Absolutely.
an art and a science to this. You said, I'm glad you asked. I was going to ask you about the NASA thing. You also said emotional intelligence. So I just feel like that's at the root of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So how big of a component is just being sort of? I think also. Let me say this. So emotionally aware is another word that I would use as well. Emotionally aware is a part of having emotional intelligence. You agree with that?
Absolutely. So this phrase emotional intelligence is actually kind of a misnomer because it makes us think it's like IQ.
Right.
We're either born with it or you're not, but it's not. Emotional intelligence is emotional awareness.
Okay.
If I say to myself, and I train myself to say, a priority is noticing when someone else is feeling something and matching that and giving them the space for that. That is emotional intelligence. That's the thing that's going to make it feel like you understand them, that you can empathize with them. And it's not hard, right? It's just about making it a priority.
Yeah. There's in the book a lot of examples of that. There's actually just great stories in the book. Give me one, because I want them to get the book, so I don't want to do the whole book, but give me one story from the book that's sort of illustrative of just, you thought was one of the more interesting stories in the book. So they have an understanding, because what's great about the way Charles writes this book is that there's like points and tactics, and then I like the story to sort of reinforce it. For me, facts tell, stories sell. I remember stories. And so I like the way that you've weaved these into the work.
And that's why there's so many stories in there, is because they're so much easier to remember. So one of my favorite stories is early in the book. It's about Jim Lawler, the CIA agent.
It's so good.
So Jim is this guy who I've talked to a number of times. He's awesome. He became a CIA officer when he was in his 30s, and he wanted this so bad. He struggled for he just ran after this so hard. It was like he was desperate to be a CIA officer. They accept him, they send him off to training, and then they send him to Europe to recruit for assets, and he finds out he's the worst recruiter on earth. Like literally, he would go to like parties and he couldn't make conversation. He would like try and buddy up with people, and they're like, "You're a spy, aren't you? You're trying to get me to be a spy." They're like, "I'm going to report you to the authorities. You're going to get deported." Right. So he's like freaking out because he's like, "I'm terrible at this." And then someone in his office says, "Look, there's this woman coming into town. She's from the Middle East. She works for the foreign ministry. Why don't you get to know her a little bit and see if there's anything there?" So he bumps into her at a restaurant the next day, right? Bumps.
Okay.
And he introduces himself as an oil speculator, strikes up a conversation, takes her to lunch the next day. They start sightseeing together, sort of develops a little bit of a relationship. He goes and he says to his boss, "I think I'm recruiting this woman. I think she's going to be an asset for us." And then his boss is like, "That's fantastic. Good. I'm glad to hear it." He goes, he has dinner with this woman, Fatma, and he says, "I'm not an oil speculator. I work for the CIA." Now, Fatma had been telling him, she comes from he never told me which nation, but it's pretty obvious which one it is.
Right.
She comes from a nation that recently had a religious theocracy revolution. And so the fundamentalists have all taken over, and she hates it. Okay. She's like, they're making women wear hijabs. They're telling us we can't go to college. I want to fight this, but I don't know how. And so Jim Lawler says to her the most practical thing possible. He's like, "We want the same thing you do. Like we want to free the people of your country. We want to empower women. Work for me for the CIA." Mm-hmm. And she grabs the table and starts shaking her head, and she starts crying. Mm-hmm. And she goes, no, I'm not going to do it. And just has a meltdown. Mm-hmm. And she says, "They kill people in my country for doing this. I cannot believe that you have put me at risk simply by striking up a friendship. Because if they ever find out you're in the CIA, they're going to think I'm in the CIA." And she just bolts. And Lawler's like, "I'm terrible at this. Like, I'm such a bad recruiter." So he goes back to his boss and he tells him what happened. His boss is like, "Dude, I already told Washington, D.C. you recruited her as a spy. Like you're going to get fired if you can't close the deal on this. This is your last chance. That's why we gave it to you." Mm-hmm. So Jim spends all this time trying to figure out what do I do? And he keeps on calling Fatima, and eventually she picks up and he invites her to go to dinner. But a couple nights before she's going to fly back home. And she says yes because he says he'd take her to an expensive restaurant. And he has a notebook full of ideas on how to convert her. And he knows none of them are going to work. Like, you cannot trick someone into taking a suicidal risk. Right? It's just not going to. So he goes to dinner, and she's really down because she's like, I came to Europe. I thought I was going to learn something about how to be more myself or how to change the world. And I'm just going home and I'm the same person. And what he starts trying to do is cheer her up. He tells her little stories. He reminisces about when they, went sightseeing together, and she just gets more and more glum. Mm. And finally dessert comes, and they're kind of by themselves at the table. And Jim thinks to himself, like, should I try to recruit her again? And he's like, if I do that, she's literally going to stand up and walk away. Mm. So what he decides to do is he decides, this isn't going to work. I'm giving up. I'm just going to have a real conversation. I'm going to be honest. And he starts saying to her, look, I know how you feel because I feel exactly the same way. I wanted this job my entire life, and it turns out I'm terrible at it. I am so disappointed in myself. Mm. And I don't know how I'm going to go home and tell my dad that I failed. I got fired by the CIA. Mm. And he talks this way. Now what he's doing, obviously, without even realizing it, is he's matching her.
He's matching.
Right? She was glum, and he was trying to cheer her up. That's not matching.
Yep.
He was matching her, and she's listening to this, and she starts crying, and he's like, I'm such a jerk. And in the CIA, you have to report every conversation. So he's going to have to write up a memo, and he's like, those guys are going to fire me within seconds. They're just going to laugh at. And he reaches over and he pats her arm, and he's like, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to make you cry. I am sorry. Mm. And she says, no, I think I can do this. Wow. And he's so inexperienced. He actually, the first things out of his mouth is like, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to, because he wasn't trying to manipulate her. He was just trying to.
He finally wasn't.
Yeah, he finally wasn't trying to manipulate her. And he's like, no, I don't want to put you at risk. You don't have to do it. And she says, no, what you want is important. I think we can do this together. So for the first time, she was able to hear him. She was able to hear all those things that he had said over weeks and weeks and weeks about helping the women of her country. She couldn't hear it until he matched her. Next day, she goes to a safe house. She gets trained in covert communications and other stuff. She's the best source in the Middle East for the next 20 years.
Unbelievable.
And Jim Lawler becomes one of the top recruiters in the entire CIA. He teaches it today.
It's one of the best stories ever.
I love that story.
I'm going to pick it apart a little so people understand the dynamic in there. So when you say matching, was it that she was in an emotional conversation and he wasn't? Is that what you mean by that?
That's a huge part of it.
Okay, he was also vulnerable.
But he was also vulnerable. So she was, not only was she in an emotional conversation, but he was listening to the type of emotion that she was transmitting, right?
Okay.
Instead of saying like, oh, you shouldn't feel bad, I'm going to cheer you up. He was saying like, look, you feel bad. Like, let's just acknowledge that. And that matching feels good because it feels like someone's hearing us.
I think it's a huge thing. I don't ever like saying gender specific stuff because I don't believe it, but I do think by and large, those two elements, women are better at naturally, meaning I think they're more naturally vulnerable in a conversation than a man can be. And I don't even like saying this, but I think in general, most people would agree with me. And then secondly, I think men try to fix things more often, so that when there is an emotional conversation you're in, we just want to fix it or solve the problem or be the savior or be valuable or be important rather than just be with somebody and acknowledge their emotion.
It's not always men and women, right?
Sure,
but
it's not. It's definitely not, but it's more prevalent, I think.
And I think what's happening there is we're falling back on what feels comfortable to us.
Right, it is for sure.
So if you're saying something emotional and I get super practical and it pisses you off, it's not so much that like I actually think we should be practical. It's that I'm uncomfortable with emotion.
There you go.
And so I'm going back to my safe place.
There you go.
And actually that safe place is emotional, right? Like the reason I'm trying to solve your problem is like, it really bothers me that you're upset. I don't know how to deal with the fact that you're upset. I want to make you feel better. I feel like that's my job, and I feel like I'm letting you down and myself down. Like that is emotional, right?
You're right.
I'm just disguising it as a practical conversation because that's my safe space.
That's my pattern. That's how I hide.
Yeah.
That's 1,000,000% right. All right, I told you we were going to go a bit long, so we're gonna. So,
absolutely.
Okay, let me ask you this. This is a hard one, and so I keep using the term nonverbal. I've used that. Let me couch it a little differently.
Okay.
Literally nonverbal.
Okay.
So types of communication that are not done verbally, meaning
email,
mail, written, email, text, whatever.
Yeah.
I have found for me, if I'm transparent with people, I feel like I'm a pretty darn good verbal communicator. I've also found my friends that are hyper-verbal people, in general, again, another generality, aren't so good in the written word. And for some reason, when I write or text, it comes across as harsh, curt, sometimes aloof. My writing style does not make the impact in text or email that my verbal style does. And I'm really not very good at that. So what about tips or keys on that?
So what's going on there? So it's interesting. If we were having this conversation about 100 years ago, a little bit under 100 years ago, when phones first became popular, what we would be talking about, and there were all these articles that said this, no one will ever be able to communicate on the telephone well. Because unless you can see someone, you're not going to figure out what's going on in their voice. You're not like telephone communication is basically going to be for like sending over like grocery orders. Now, you and I are both Gen X, right? Like when we were kids, we were on the phone for like 7 hours a night.
100%.
I have friendships where I only talk to the person on the phone.
So do I. And I still remember the phone numbers of my friends when I was a kid. I don't know anybody's phone number now, but I know Andy Quirin's phone number.
Yes, right? It's like in there.
Right, it's true.
And so what's interesting is if we were to watch ourselves talking on the phone, what we would find is that we behave a little bit differently on the phone. When you're on the phone, people tend to over-enunciate because they know that they can't see us, right? We tend to explain ourselves a little bit more. And when we make a joke, we laugh faster to let the other person know it's a joke. We know that they don't have the visual signal. And so we're trying to compensate by giving them more audio. Wow. So good. Now the thing is, we've been talking on the phones for over 100 years. We've been communicating face-to-face for millennia. The first email was sent in 1982, right? Most people didn't get an email account until the late 90s. We basically have 20 years of learning how to communicate digitally.
Good point.
We have not, though the rules about how that channel is different have not become intuitive yet. So the solution is we have to think about it more when we're texting or emailing. And we have to say to ourselves, okay, and these are the tips. When I am online and I'm communicating that way, politeness matters a lot more than when I'm face-to-face. And study after study has shown this, that if you say please and thank you in an email, there's like 70% higher response rate.
Okay.
Because I need to signal it, right? If I'm texting you, I can be short, but if I send you an email and I treat it like a text, unless we're good friends,
That's my problem
Like
right
it's gonna rub you the wrong way, right? So part of it is just saying, what are the rules for this particular channel? Because our instinct is to say the rules for one channel is the rules for every channel.
You're right.
So we treat email and text and Slack and everything exactly the same way. But the truth is, if you just take a second and you say like, oh, I don't have to say please necessarily in this text because it could be short, but every email I should like bend over backwards to be a little bit more polite. It works wonders.
Brother, I'm such a bad emailer. I'm so lazy with emails. I sometimes don't even put my name at the end of it. You know what I mean? Never mind a thank you. I think I'm the worst emailer that's ever lived. And I've had a lot of people, even that I've worked with, even like in the podcast space, with like, man, when I met you, you're so nice and kind, but I read your emails, you're scary. I'm like, really? I didn't mean it that way. I was just trying to get to the point so we could go do something else. I thought email was the faster way, but you're 100% right. The rules of engagement, so to speak, are something that I've been oblivious to. That right there was huge for me.
And sometimes you can establish new rules, right? Like if you say to your employees, like, look, I just want you to know I'm going to send you brusque emails because like I'm moving a million miles an hour. You should not read anything into that.
Yeah.
Now we know the rule.
Well, now I've pre-framed it, but I don't do that.
Yeah.
And I
know.
treat everybody like they should know better, and they don't. And by the way, the worst thing I'll do is I'll get a nice long, 6-paragraph email, and I reply with like 7 words.
Right.
And I wonder why they feel dismissed. Yet
Sounds
in a
great.
conversation, that's my daughter. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the extent of my emails to people. So you're 1,000% right.
My son texts me K. He doesn't even put okay. He just puts K. I'm like, how much lazier can you get?
I relate to that.
But that setting the ground rules, figuring out the rules together, we can do that in a conversation too. So if we're talking about, say, race, right, which is a tough topic, if I start that conversation by saying, I'd like to talk to you about this, and I just want to acknowledge it will likely be awkward. I will probably make mistakes and say things that I don't really, I'm not saying it the right way. You're probably going to make mistakes. Like, I think just as a ground rule, like, let's just say it's okay to say things and forgive each other for not getting it right. So now we've established now all of a sudden that conversation about race feels so much easier.
Right. We're both open. We're both vulnerable. We've both given ourselves some space to make a mistake and share our real thoughts. And the other thing is, if you don't create that space, then you're really not saying what you really think either, and it's not an authentic exchange.
That's exactly
I agree.
right. When
you ask for permission. I'm going to ask you 2 more things.
Sure.
Okay. You said earlier something about repeating back to someone, hey, what I think I heard you say was, help me understand this, right?
Yeah.
I love that and totally agree.
So sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I want you to reply with that. And then also, what about the conversation's been over to me. When I feel the most listened to, you and I had lunch together, okay? And you did that. But 7:30 that night, I get a message from you. You're gone, I'm gone, and you say, I just want to tell you something. I enjoyed our conversation so much, and the way that you spoke about your wife or what you shared about blah, 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 I just want to tell you it was so meaningful for me. To me, that's like what you suggested on steroids, that actually after the conversation is ended, I come back later and say, not only have I listened to what you said, but I've been thinking about what you said, and it made a difference to me. I just want to share that I do that, and I think that's a way of me saying I really value and appreciate what we discussed.
And it feels so good. I've gotten an email like that from you, and like it felt really good to get it. And it was a great conversation,
right?
But like to know that it was meaningful to you, and it's much like laughing. It's you saying like, I want to connect. Like,
you wanted to say something, and I think I jumped in front of it.
Oh, I was just going to talk about this looping for understanding. These 3.
Yes.
So looping for understanding. There's 3 steps to it. You ask a question, hopefully a deep question. Repeat back in your own words what you heard someone say.
Okay.
And then step number 3, ask if you got it right.
Ask if you got it right.
And it's that 3rd step that we often forget to do and is the most powerful.
Okay.
Because what I'm saying when I ask you if I got it right, and I do this all the time, I'm like, let me tell you what I hear you saying, and like tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is that we are saying to them, not only do I want to understand you, I acknowledge that I might have missed something, and you might have phrased it in a way that doesn't actually capture what you want. And so like when someone says that to me, when they're like, tell me if I'm getting this right, and they repeat back what I just said, I actually find it valuable as the speaker, because I'm like, No. You like I did a bad job of explaining like the thing that like I really care about because you didn't pick up on it and you were listening. I need to get better at that, and that feels good.
That's outstanding. All right, last question. First off, let me say this. This is awesome.
Oh, thank you.
And I both times we've had to interact together like this, it flies by for me. And frankly, that's because you're a super communicator. And
as are you.
Thank you. And the quality of your work. Listen, guys, there's a lot of books. This man doesn't write a ton of them because they're so good when he writes them. There's so much in here, even in today's podcast. Like, I hope you understand the value of getting good at these, what I would call almost nuances that make all the difference in the world. So this is a broad question, just framing it differently. I want to finish with it.
And thank you for that, by the way.
It's true.
You do something you talk about in the book, we might as well just start there. You have the ability to take really complicated things and make them seem simple.
Yeah.
And you talk about that as actually one of the laws in the book of being able to be a great communicator. Is that something that you do? I'm sure you do it intentionally, but do you do it naturally?
Well, I do it intentionally. Let me say this. I was a good student, but I wasn't a great student. And so a lot of times when I was in college or in a classroom, I would want the professor to break it down and make it much more simple. I would look around the room and I said, am I the only one that's having a hard time here and not maybe grasping and learning like I need to? And so I really, as a student, I worked on helping. When I would hear a talk, I would say, how could that be reduced so I can apply it to my life?
Yeah.
And so it almost started as a student. And I learned to reduce things and bring them down. And I tell people all the time, I'm a communicator, not an educator. You know, an educator takes something simple and makes it complicated. I mean, that's just who they are. I mean, honestly, if you're in the education world, if you're not confused, they're not pleased. You know what I'm saying? And then a communicator takes something complicated, makes it simple. And so my whole goal is to make things very palatable for people. One of the things I teach in the book is the fact that if you have to keep explaining what you just said, you haven't said it right the first time. I mean, and how many times we have a person explain. I just sit there and think, why didn't you take some time on the front end to simplify this so that everybody can apply it to their life? And there are three, real quickly, there are three kind of, I take the simplistic. I start with simplistic. And simplistic is not good. It's fast and it's easy, but it's not really deep and helpful. And it's a half truth. It's never a whole truth. You know. So if I say things like experience is the best teacher, that's a simplistic statement. But it's not true. If it were true, then as people got older, everybody get better. And I know a whole bunch of people, they're getting older, but they're not getting better. The experience isn't helping them at all. Although experience is not the best teacher, reflection and learning from that experience is the best teacher.
Wow.
So how do I get from experience as the best teacher to reflection and learning from experience as the best teacher? Well, you've got to go from simplistic to complicated or complex. In other words, you've got to wrestle with the statements. And you've got to contextually take them from every angle until you can come to something that is really solid and something that is really true and something that really works. And so just as simplistic is easy and fast, you know, complicated is slow and deep. But once you come through that, and it takes a while to do that, once you come through it on the simple side now, it's fast, but it's deep. In other words, people can grab it real quick, but then they go home and they think about it, Ed, and they just can't get away from it. Like when you wrote the book, when you wrote the book, The Power of One More, that is so simple that you can grasp it immediately, but you can't. You have to spend a lot of time on it to work it out in your life.
What a great point. Yeah, what a great point. Yeah.
And so here's the issue. I think in communication, when I was a young communicator, I saw that I had charisma, and I saw that I could probably get by on stage with having fun with people and enjoying them and making them laugh. And I came to this decision: am I going to wing it, or am I going to work for it? And I was tempted to wing it because I could wing it and I could get by with it. See, here's the challenge. When you're gifted in a certain area, you can wing it and still be successful.
Right.
You can be in that top 20%.
Yes.
But to work for it, that's a whole different game. And in the law of simplicity, you have to work for this. You have to work. Simple is hard work. But if you work for it, you can get in the top 2%.
Yeah.
And so what I tell people all the time is the tendency and the temptation is in giftedness is you don't give it all because you just don't have to give it all. I mean, it comes. But because you don't give it all, you do well, but you don't do very, very well. But if you would just work on that area of giftedness, you get in that top 2%, and you know as well as I do, if you're in the top 2%, whatever it is, you own whatever you want to own. The world is yours. And so simple, I decided at a very young age, in my 20s, I was going to work for it. I'm just going to work for it. And I spent a lot of time. This morning I write every day. This morning I was writing, and I was wanting to make a statement, and I worked on a statement probably for 40 minutes. Mm-mm. And I would write it, and I said, no, that's not quite right. Got to work. No, it's not. Still doesn't fit. And then finally, about 20 minutes later, I thought, okay, I got it. There it is. So I get up and I make this statement, and people say, oh my gosh, that guy just flows out of him. No, it didn't flow out of me. It didn't either. It had to cook and work it inside of me a long time, but I get it to the place where it flows out of me. But it doesn't flow. Good stuff doesn't happen automatically.
I told you earlier that you're a world-class communicator. And at first, when I was driving here today, because I've watched your videos, I listened to you talk, and I appreciate great communicators because I'd like to think I'm working on being one myself, right? And so
you're a great one, but you're being very modest.
Well, I like you. I hate hearing the sound of my own voice, probably. Sure. Right? We'll watch this back, and there'll be a million things I wish I said or did differently. And that's always the case with me. But see, it's interesting. It struck me. I'm like, well, he's in the fitness business. I wonder why that was so important. And then I started to think about it. Is there really any business where that's not critical? So talk a little bit about. I'm sure even with your Fit Body Bootcamp franchisees, the ability to communicate with people, to persuade, to influence people to do things for their own betterment. How important has that been in your journey, and do you think it is for all entrepreneurs? I think there's some guys think, well, I'm a tech entrepreneur, so this doesn't matter. You're still gonna have to market something or hire people or persuade them to join your firm. How important is persuasion, articulation, communication?
It's a lost art these days, unfortunately, because we text so much. I saw a study, a video. The professor took two students from the same class, college students, put them back to back in a chair without their cell phone, and they said, communicate. And it was very awkward and clunky. Hi, how are you? Good. What are you doing? Okay. Handed them their cell phones. They're still back to back, and you could see their screens, and they started to communicate, Ed. So with emojis, exclamation points. So verbal communication, physical communication, the art of getting your message across and influencing others and painting the word picture so that they can be all in on your vision is a lost art.
Yes.
Now, English is a second language to me. I had to learn this language first, then I had to learn how to communicate with it second. Everything I've wanted in life, whether it's building this franchise, networking with amazing people like you, has been an outcome of communication. I communicate through video, through podcasts, through blog posts, through Facebook Lives, you name it, we communicate. And if we can't articulate well and draw the word picture for others to get on board with our message.
Picture. That's interesting.
That's what we're doing. We're drawing a word picture. If I say, imagine if, Ed, you're sitting in a room that looks like a library, and it looks very old-time library, with a beautiful oil painting of an amazing dog across from you, which right across the way, there's my dog.
This man has an oil painting in his office. So there's pictures of his family in here somewhere, I'm sure. But the main picture in this office that I'm staring at is of your dog on the wall here. That's with a crown on. Is it her, Ed?
Cookie.
Is it a her or he?
It's a her.
It's a her.
Yeah.
So we're staring at Cookie. She's watched this entire interview.
But imagine if we weren't in this room and I said, Ed, imagine if, and I started to draw this word picture to you, you would picture this room. Yeah. And we need to get better at that level of communication to draw word pictures, because when people can see it in their mind's eye, they now commit to it mentally and emotionally and are willing to buy into your vision, your agenda, whatever your thing is. So without communication, I believe that we are lost as leaders, as entrepreneurs, as teachers, as politicians. With communication, we can lead the masses hopefully to a better place.
Wow, so good, man. Like one of the things I notice about you and your ability, by the way, I love that word pictures analogy. I'm going to steal that from you. The other thing that you do really well, and I want people to hear this because they're experiencing it, but I want you to know what you're experiencing. You can't transfer energy through text or email. You can transfer information. You can't transfer energy. You can't transfer word pictures. So one of the things you do in an exemplary way is you transfer energy. The way you communicate makes me feel something, right? Like strength, intensity, passion, empathy, whatever it is. Great communicators can transfer energy to people. You can't transfer to me something that which you're not already experiencing yourself. You can't give me what you don't have. The reason you're such a gifted communicator is you're experiencing these things yourself. You've already won. You've already been successful. You already feel these things. So,
and I know, by the way, I know people will probably, leave comments and messages, but what if I don't have the gift that he has? I just want to reinforce to others that English was a second language to me, and this is a learned behavior.
Yeah. I should say something about that too, because I'm using the word giftedness. And so here's what I think. I think that everybody can get to a point of being super great communicators. I also think someone like you were born probably with the ability to have this, and you refined it and refined it and refined it. I think all humans have the ability to give energy. Some are better at doing it with a spoken word. Some are better to do it with a look. Some are better to do it with a touch. But we all have the capacity to transfer energy to one another. I just think one of yours is with the spoken word. I just think you're excellent. I think everybody can develop that skill. So I'm glad that you mentioned that too.
You are the messenger and you are the message. That's made. You got people who are speaking out here. It's been hijacked with speaking to sell. Yeah. We sell people on their greatness. We sell people on the things that they need to do now, the methods, the techniques, the strategy to create the next greatest version of themselves. And when we do that, we know that when we make that kind of impact, we know that we're in the place of what Leo Tolstoy, the Russian author, he said, what in the meaning and purpose of my life that will not be undone and destroyed when I'm gone? And the people that listen to your program and their mind and their vision has been expanded, you give them a vision of themselves beyond the adversities of what they're experiencing in this place where we are right now, and help them to begin to live their life from a place of optimism that they're going to impact other people, and those people are going to impact other people. And this work that you, as much as you have chosen this, you were chosen for this. And this work will not be undone. You're going to impact generations yet unborn.
Thank you. My gosh, I'm getting chills all over. One of the I'm always watching you, right? And so thank you for that. Like sincerely, someone or something could not be more special to me than what you've just said. I want you to also watch something with Les, everybody. He speaks greatness into people. I really believe that it seems small, but he speaks greatness into people. He speaks to their better self. All of his messages always end with, there's greatness in you. And I just think that all of us should just be conscious of this. I'd be making a huge mistake. I have the greatest speaker I've ever seen on my show. Is there anything you would impart onto somebody who's listening and says, I'd like to be a better communicator? Are there a couple keys that the best ever would share with me about how I could become a better communicator if I'm listening or watching the show right now?
You know, Serena Williams is considered a dominant tennis player on the planet, but she has a coach. Muhammad Ali said, I'm the greatest, but he never won a championship without Angelo Dundee. Michael Jordan considered one of the great basketball players, but he never won a championship without Phil Jackson. I was with Maya Angelou. I had the honor of spending a day with her. And she said, it aggravates me when they say that I'm a gifted communicator. And I said, why? She said, show me a gifted heart surgeon. I work at this. She said, do you see these books around here? I said, yes, ma'am. When I was raped and I went into a catatonic state and didn't speak, my grandmother brought her lady here to help me and to tutor me. And she said, I want you to start there and start reading these books and give me a report. And she said, one day she came to this lady, and she had written something she was very proud of. And she went, and this lady said, "You can talk. Read it to me." She said, "You can talk." And her mother was standing there and didn't intervene. And her mother always defended her. And this woman who wrote, "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," she said, "You can talk now." And the reason she stopped talking, when she told on her uncle, the man, the neighbor who raped her, they beat him to death. And she felt personally responsible and went into a catatonic state. And on that day, she said, "Speak, you can speak." And she started reading on that day. Wow. And that lady helped her to get her voice back. She had swallowed her voice because of the trauma of feeling as a young kid, I caused someone to be killed because he raped me. And she did, that was heavy for her. And so we, all of us are born the same way, dumb, naked, and speechless. We can learn. I didn't do what I'm doing now. For 14 years, I told Mike Williams, I said, "Mike, I can't speak, man, like Zig Ziglar." He said, "You can." I said, "Look, Tony Robbins and all those guys." He said, "Browning, you go hear those guys because it's in you. That's in you." And sometimes I feel that you have to believe in somebody's belief in you until your belief kicks in. And I was at an event, I think it was a Bob Proctor event, and a guy was speaking, man. And here I am there, and all of us had moments when we feel a speaker is just talking to us. You've had people who say, you were talking to me, and this was my day. And this guy was speaking, he stopped. He said, "There's somebody here who should be up here holding this mic. I'm standing in your dream. And you've convinced yourself that you can't do it, that you don't have what it takes. And I'm here to say that it's not what you don't have, it's what you think you need in order to do this." Now, mind you, I'm here thinking I don't have a college education. And so then he went on speaking. He said, "I'm going to say this, and I'm not going to say it anymore. You're out there squirming in your seat right now." He said, and he was looking over the audience, and I'm saying to myself, "Is this guy looking for me?" And then he said, "The reason I'm standing up here and you are seated out there squirming in your seat, I represent the thoughts you have rejected for yourself." Oh. Man, that was like he punched me in the gut. I jumped up, I had a dime. I went to a payphone, I called Mike Williams, my mentor. I said, "Mike," he said, "Brownie, what's wrong?" I said, "Listen to me, Mike." "Brownie, calm down." "No, I'm not rejecting myself anymore. Do you hear me, Mike? I'm not rejecting myself anymore. My mother has breast cancer and she needs me. And all I got is just my voice, Mike. I can't get a job. I don't have a college education. All I got is the ability to talk to people. I got to use my voice to help Mama. No job is going to pay me enough money to get the help that she needs. Most people don't know 95% of people who file bankruptcy do so because of medical expenses. And when he said that, I said, I gotta speak. There's an African proverb that says, if there's no enemy within, the enemy outside can do us no harm. Shakespeare said, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings." I was living a small life, and you can't fit a big dream or a big voice in a small mind.
Oh my gosh, come on. By the way, what's crazy is God's so good. I gave a talk this weekend. I gave one quote, which was that African proverb you just quoted. But my gosh, that story. All right,
Everyone, I know you want less here 4 hours. I do too. How do you talk
Yeah.
with somebody if it's a difficult conversation? One of the things I saw that you said is you ask in your writing, do your patterns of judging others reflect behaviors you don't like or want to recognize or won't recognize about yourself? So when we're in a difficult conversation with somebody, you know, maybe we disagree with them. I want to go to the hard stuff first. Like I'm a Republican and someone's a Democrat, or I'm a Democrat and someone's a Republican. Something like that, you know, these hard conversations. What are some of the keys in being better at doing it so it's actually a productive experience?
There are definitely keys that we're going to talk about. And it's also important to know that when you're in a difficult conversation, both parties have to be willing to start with truth. And if we can't have a foundation of truth, then you're going to have the conversation will remain difficult. There's opinions and there's facts and there's emotions. And we get all of those mixed up, right? And they all get discombobbled and jumbled up in our brain. But if we realize that my opinion is just my opinion and it's not the truth, then we can say, okay, what's driving my opinion? And we sort of can open our hand and go, this is why I'm thinking how I'm thinking. This is what my standards are. There's 4 archetypal questions in the book. This is what I'm worried about. This is my concern. Here's what I'd like. We can start to just open our hands and say, okay, I have an opinion. Let's dance with that. And let's see what we can learn from each other. That's a very different conversation with fists than fists coming at each other.
Yeah. And you also say in the book that I've learned to do this myself, is to fall in love with asking questions.
Right.
When you're talking with somebody, whether you're a business leader and trying to create change in your company, or whether you're in an argument with a spouse or disagreement, or you got to talk about something different. Like I've used politics as an example because it's the big one, right? Like they're good, we're bad. I'm right, you're wrong. And the idea of making statements all the time and telling stories as opposed to asking questions.
Right. And the idea of whether I'm doing it to myself and asking myself what's driving my opinion, what's driving my judgment, and why am I so hooked on the thing, right? We can also, the questions help us, like each question help us open someone else's hand. Because we can ask, well, what do you really want? What do you desire here? What do you want out of this? What are your standards for measuring this opinion that you have? So our questions can literally help other people unlock and unfist, right?
Yeah.
But we aren't trained to ask questions. We're trained to have answers. That's one of the major dilemmas. And then we get into school and we're rewarded for raising our hand. And then we get into business and we're rewarded for being the smartest person in the room, right?
Right.
And that's a counter to the opposite effect is asking questions.
Well, this notion of raising your hand was my next thing. So you're reading my mind. And I think one of the art forms of being a great conversationalist is actually the art of listening. And that's why questions matter so much. And you're precisely right. In school, the teacher's still talking and asking the question. We're taught, we're rewarded. Raise your hand while they're still talking. And what that does to me, I want you to speak to this. To me, what that does to me is it means I'm really not listening to what you're saying. I'm already thinking about what I'm going to say back to you in my answer or my judgment or my assessment about you. Most people are already raising their hand, you know, metaphorically, when most other people are still talking, and they wonder, why am I not connecting with this person? Why can't we find common ground? Because while they're talking, you've got your hand raised already. I got the answer. I know the truth. I want to say something, and rather finishing and letting them finish their statement. Yeah.
So our brain is spinning our answer. And so there's no space actually to absorb what's coming at us from the other person. Right. And part of that actually the main reason of that is we get addicted to our position. Our ego and our identity gets addicted to, I believe this. And if I believe this is true, then that defines who I am. And that is often why we enter with fists or why we enter, defensively, and can't just say, okay, I do have an opinion. I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to see if I can explore really what's driving this other person's thinking.
But if I just want to go back for a second, everybody, first thing to ask yourself is, what's your ability to ask questions and to ask questions without judgment as someone's answering you? In other words, can you learn the art of not raising your hand metaphorically when someone's talking and be fully present with their answer, absent as much as you can of judgment? We'll talk about triggers in a little bit because you have some brilliant stuff in there. on triggers, which I teach in other areas of life. I never thought about in terms of a conversation. But the one thing that opened my eyes and why I wanted you on, among many things, is this idea of there's 4 conversations.
Right.
And one of them is storytelling. But take the time on this and elaborate. What are the 4 different conversations and what do they mean?
So these are 4 types of conversations. They organize the book, and the reason they work well to do that is each conversation has its own lessons to learn, tools to try, practices to try on, because each conversation demands different skill sets. And they're all interconnected. And we're generally, without knowing about the conversations, we're just in conversation like fish in water. And as soon as we get, wait a minute, there's storytelling, there's collaboration, there's creativity, and there's commitment conversations, already we have a different lens to think about conversations.
That's right. Right.
If I took you to spend 6 months with the Inuits in Alaska, and they taught you there's 27 names for snow in those 6 months, when we came back to New England, you would never see snow the same way. Because all of a sudden you have distinctions about snow that allow you to see and perceive and have a different story about snow, right? Conversations the same way. If we can begin to think about different conversations and different ways to listen and different ways to ask questions and why it matters, we can't be in conversation as innocently, right?
Yeah.
We go, oh, I need to wake up here a little bit because I'm locked down and I'm creating a fight because I'm locked down, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the 4 conversations are just the beginning to say we can start looking at conversations with a better lens.
So good. The 4 he said, by the way, but I just want to make sure you get it, are storytelling, collaborative conversations, creative conversations, and commitment conversations. I want to give you a compliment on how your work helped me a little bit on the storytelling part, or listening for someone's story. I have a friend who I was watching 2 friends argue. One's very right wing and one's very left wing. Both these dudes I love. I love both these guys. And I actually understand the perspectives of both of them. And so the conversation was actually about welfare and taxes. And my left-leaning friend was, they were kind of arguing at first. And, you should be paying your fair share. You don't want to help the underprivileged. You don't know what this is like. And the other guy's like, wait a minute, you shouldn't be lazy. You should get a job and it should be temporary and the normal position. They're both really getting ingrained in it. And so because of your work, I'm like, wait a minute. And the one guy that was for welfare, I said, John, brother, really, what's the story? Like, why are you so passionate about that welfare should exist, right? God wanted to build a bridge between these dudes. And anyway, John, who, by the way, you resemble John visually. John says he's a really strong, masculine guy. And he goes, well, man, you guys don't know this, but I was on welfare. I was a little boy and it saved my family. And there was a time where, as a little boy, I was actually with my mother on the street begging for money so we could eat. And it was a horrible existence. And I was a scared little boy and it was traumatic for me. And thank God my mother got on welfare. And you know what? My mother stayed on welfare for quite a while. And my mom didn't really turn her life around, but I did. And now I'm a major league tax player. And I know you, buddy, over there on the right side, like all the taxes I'm paying. But you don't know what it's like not to have food. You don't. And I watched him tell the story and I had to force it. And I watched my right-leaning friend listen. And the judgment level, which is what you talk about, the judgment level was so far reduced, where this is a case, ironically, where the story served us.
Yeah.
And because I kind of forced it because of your work to listen. And that kind of comes from questions. And it goes to my next point with you. You talk about triggers often. This welfare conversation for my friend was a trigger why he was getting angry with the right-leaning friend. Like, you're not sensitive. You don't care. He's triggered by that thing. So talk a little bit about in ourselves evaluating our triggers when we're listening to somebody.
The storytelling conversation is the first one for a very good reason, because unless we begin to understand the stories we tell ourselves, right? Some help us, some harm us, right? But until we understand our storytelling patterns, and I use patterns in a very particular way because it takes sting out of judgment. The patterns we have around stories and patterns we have around how we get triggered, the patterns we have around reacting to people. We didn't even choose those. They're unconscious patterns by our family, by our culture, by our teachers, by our friends, or just our social stuff. So we have patterns, right? So we can start looking at the story I'm telling as a pattern. I can then look at myself with less judgment. And in a way, what your friend did was he was able to reveal his story about his childhood, right? And that there's a couple things happening. He's revealing, he's opening his hand. I'm concerned because I know what it's like to be on the other side.
Yeah.
I have my standards say that, you know, we can afford to help take care of some of these people because they do need it. And, you know, so he's revealing his hand, and also it begins to show some vulnerability. And so if I show some vulnerability, the other person, or in your case with that conversation, as your friend shared his story, that vulnerability changes the other person. That reduces that tension.
All conversations where there's tension, there's somehow involved in that is a judgment of the other person. What does one do? Because it's hard. You're like, this guy's crazy. He's out of his mind. What a bozo. You know, like it's very difficult to do. He really believes this crap. You catch yourself mid-sentence already raising your hand going, this dude is, let me fix this guy, right? Let me fix this. So what do you do when you're starting to feel this judgment or because, you know, maybe the guy is crazy, right? Like, what I found out in my life is like, you're not going to change that person by attacking them. You're not going to change that person by somehow being more authoritative than them, which we'll talk about in a minute in business about the power dynamic. But what is a practice that I can do when I'm in mid-judgment almost of somebody going, what in the world are you talking about? Is there something you do? What's a technique or a thought?
One technique I like, and it's a sort of a metaphor of if something's coming at you and you really dislike what's going on, your automatic pattern, right, is to react.
Yes.
Right? Because it goes into your system, goes through your brain, and the pattern pops out. Very little effort on your part.
That's right. That's right.
Right?
It's triggered.
So the idea is to begin to name your patterns. So if you have a pattern of where a certain kind of person or a certain kind of conversation, whether it's politics or sex or abortion, that is a trigger for you, just be totally aware of that pattern and name it. In fact, there's a thing called voice dialogue where you can actually name that voice in your head. Like there's snobby Chuck, or there's intellectual Chuck, or there's hurt little boy Chuck. You know, you can sort of name it. And if you can name the patterns and become familiar with it,
very good,
then you might be able to catch it before it enters your body.
It loses its power over you when you become aware of it and name it. Yeah.
And then you can catch it. And then if you catch it, then literally in the book, the 4 questions that peppers through the book, just ask yourself, is there a power issue here? If I have a strong judgment, what standard am I basing that on? I mean, standards are in every judgment we have.